I'm going to be joined now by Andrew Clennell, who's coming to us from Canberra. We'll go through some of that detail and see what we think is a bit interesting. Andrew Clennell, thank you for your time. Great to have you on the show, as normal, always anyway, but particularly on the back of that. Let's start first with the leadership positions. We know that the Prime Minister was endorsed, as we'd expect, unopposed this morning. We know Richard Marles was also endorsed. He's from Labor's right faction. Confirmed just now he will take the defence portfolio. Also, I think in a very big move, we know Penny Wong in Foreign Affairs will be the Senate leader for the government. But the deputy in the Senate was Kristina Keneally. Now it will be the factional boss out of South Australia, Don Farrell. Now, what I think is intriguing here, not only is he now in a leadership position, he's also been given what in other governments were two separate ministerial jobs. He's got trade and tourism, and he's also got the Special Minister of State, which controls how elections are run and all the sort of internal political machinations. In that leadership team there for the Labor Party, there is only one woman. And of course, this is the group that meets in the Prime Minister's office every day of a sitting week. What do you make of just that bracket of announcements?
Well, I think that there are 10 women in this cabinet. And for example, in the Abbott cabinet, as you'd be familiar, Peter, there was one woman in the leadership group, but also just one woman in the cabinet. So you can see they're making a point there. But I take your point on only one woman. That's the departure of Kristina Keneally that causes that. Don Farrell and Richard Marles get their pick of portfolios, and that's what occurred here. They know him as the Godfather, Don Farrell. He sponsored Peter Malinauskas into politics. He's a South Australian colleague of Penny Wong, except that was always going to be a right-wing position with her being a left-winger. So, yes, I mean, I'm never comfortable with the fact that a caucus decides a ministry as opposed to a Prime Minister, but they take into account the sort of things a Liberal national team also takes into account, including representation from various states and men and women and the like.
Some of the other positions I felt were interesting. Katie Gallagher, sure, she's the Finance Minister. We would expect that. She was sworn in earlier, just after the government was elected. But she's also taking on women. I think that's pretty contentious given her role as one of the mean girls. There are plenty of other women. There are 9 other women in the cabinet. I'm surprised it wasn't considered more prudent to give another of those women that role. A shift too for Tanya Plibersek. We know she loves education. She's been talking about education even after the election was concluded. She's been moved into environment and water. What do you read into that?
Well, I think she's been demoted, and I think Anthony Albanese has long seen her as a leadership rival. And she started the term with education, skills and training, and then she had education after she had skills and training ripped off her and given to Richard Marles. And now she's got environment and water. And he made a point then she's got to handle the Murray-Darling Basin, one of the most contentious and difficult and unsolvable issues in Australian politics. So I think there's no doubt. And what sort of a profile is she going to get in that role? So he says she's happy. I'm glad Michelle Grattan asked that question. That would have been the question I asked. It seems to me that she's been demoted. And you can see that some of, I mean, of course this always happens, Peter, as you know, but some of Anthony Albanese's closest allies have been rewarded. You know, Murray Watt is into cabinet. Tony Burke has been given employment on top of IR. And it seems to me that he's demoted Plibersek. I always think that's a little bit unwise, that sort of tactic. You know, the old saying, friends close, enemies closer. Well, maybe not closer, but don't unnecessarily annoy them in politics, if you know what I mean.
Interestingly too, she's from New South Wales, and New South Wales, the basin community of New South Wales, those farming areas out in the west, generally very difficult every time the basin's brought up because they lose out to the South Australian, bottom end of the Murray-Darling Basin. Interestingly, I expected Michelle Rowland to take communications. She's been a shadow in a very complex portfolio for some time. She's very well regarded. Murray Watt, you've talked about a move into cabinet. That's also a reward, I think, for Queensland. But Ed Husic, who infamously made way for Kristina Keneally in the past, he's elevated straight into cabinet.
Yeah, well, the New South Wales right backed Anthony Albanese into the top job, and I think that's been rewarded here. They've got a fair representation in Cabinet with Burke, Bowen, Rowland, Husick and Clare. I think the move of Clare to Education is rather interesting. I really didn't expect that one. Claire O'Neill to Home Affairs is kind of interesting as well. I know she wasn't that happy when she got aged care, but he's given her that very big responsibility. That's a big challenge for her. So it'll be interesting to see how that one goes.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. I mean, she has a big brain. I've read some of her speeches. She gives quite a thoughtful, substantive policy speech, and she's given some speeches about the philosophical direction of the Labor Party. So I think there's lots of gears to Clare O'Neill. I'm probably giving her a death wish by even praising her coming from Peter Credlin. But what was interesting in this portfolio, she's never been in government before. She's coming straight in from opposition. If I talk about complexity, Home Affairs, which was a number of portfolio areas, departments joined together under Peter Dutton, I think that's a big brief to get across. And of course, as the Prime Minister said, they'll hit the ground running on Thursday. The National Security Committee of Cabinet will meet. The Expenditure Review Committee will meet. Jim Chalmers has already signalled he'll bring down an updated budget in October. So the ERC, the Budget Committee, I'm not surprised, are going to get to work straight away.
Yeah, and so they should, and Parliament's not till late July. Well, I guess they have to have some legislation. I also think it's interesting aged care has come into Cabinet with Mark Butler, and obviously that was Clare O'Neill's former portfolio. You've also got an aged care minister out of the ministry, but you'll recall, Peter, that Richard Colbeck was making such a mess of things that Greg Hunt ended up taking on that role in the Cabinet. So given all his aged care promises, fitting, I guess, that that position does have a place in Cabinet with, again, one of his allies in Mark Butler.
A couple of other things I want to mention. Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney-General, will also be the Cabinet Secretary. Now, in the Howard era, the Cabinet Secretary was a senior political staffer. It's charged with, obviously, the Cabinet minutes being signed off and working the agenda through Cabinet. It was moved under Malcolm Turnbull to be an MP, and Scott Morrison, as did Tony Abbott, brought it back to being a senior political staff appointment. Here they've given back to the politicians. I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think Bill Heffernan had it under Howard, didn't he? And I don't know how close Albanese is to Mark Dreyfus, I must confess. I wouldn't have thought they were that close. It is an interesting appointment. I'll be eager to watch Mark Dreyfus as Attorney-General. He's been one always writing to the AFP about various ministers and copped some flack from that. I'm not convinced how he will go in the role. Just wanted to make a point about Home Affairs too, Peter. I revealed yesterday that Michael Pizzullo is going to stay in Home Affairs. The department head, Peter Dutton, respected him. So he's not going to Defence, as has been speculated. So I can imagine some Yes Minister moments there. But I guess my point on that is they will Clare O'Neill and Albanese will really be looking at him to keep the ship together, if you'll pardon the pun, to keep the boats out. And he'll play a big role there in supporting a new minister.
And NDIS too, we talk about leadership rivals. Bill Shorten's there, is in the Cabinet. He keeps NDIS. Minister for Government Services, which is basically putting you in the cupboard. There's nothing there in terms of sexy media content or stakeholder engagement. That's the government talking to the government. Is that also a concern that like Plibersek, that he's got two aspirants there, or has Bill Shorten put away his baton, as they say?
I reckon Bill Shorten would expect what he got because that's what he had as a shadow. I'm not saying that he might not cause Anthony Albanese difficulties down the track, but as I'm sitting here as a political analyst, Peter, and the bell's going off in my head in terms of warning signs for Anthony Albanese, if I'm putting myself in a strategist's shoes, it's more around the Plibersek appointment. And, Tanya Plibersek's very popular. I think the Australian people would like to see her in a high-profile role. So you don't want to look petty in appearing to demote her.
The other point I'm just going to make before we go into some other things, resources is on its lonesome under Madeleine King with Northern Australia. Energy is with climate change. The point I made before about water being split away from agriculture, water's with the environment. Again, that's a signal from the left to their constituency. But climate change with energy is also a symbol to the constituency. Precisely what Malcolm Turnbull did, if you remember, Josh Frydenberg had that sort of portfolio at one stage, and they ended up being so incompatible that they had to go back to standalone portfolios, but they're going to try that there with Chris Bowen.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Angus Taylor might have had both in the last cabinet. And so I guess they're keeping that moving. They shadowed him and they're adopting the same kind of model. But yeah, I've always found it interesting. It's split from environment, etc. That energy goes together with climate change. I guess you'd expect that from the Labor government. Their signature policy, apart from putting the poles and wires up, it seems, is that climate target, 43% by 2030.
All right, just before we go, we got to 76 today for Labor. That means majority government. Highly likely they'll actually get to 77. But still a lot of talk, Andrew Clennell, about an independent speaker.
So my mail on this is if it is 76, there will be an independent speaker, Peter, but I think he's going to get lucky yet again, Anthony Albanese, and win Gilmore by like 100 votes or 200 votes, have 77, in which case the factional support is apparently behind Milton Dick, the Queenslander, and he'll have his own speaker. But it really rested on that number, and he's had some good news on that front today. I think even Andrew Constance thinks it's hard to win Gilmore from here. I think it's arguable that Andrew Constance got himself a 5% swing in that seat, because if you look at the rest of New South Wales and Australia, it certainly didn't go the way that Constance brought it, but it looks like he's just fallen short. And despite the loss of Fowler, Albanese gets that clear majority and his own speaker, I think, Peter.
All right, lots to digest. I know you're going to run off and pick up the phone and call a few people. Andrew Clennell, I appreciate your time tonight. Right, the other thing, of course, with this announcement, you just get a press release tonight. What I'm always interested in having a look at are the administrative orders that sit behind these names and portfolios, particular agencies and offices inside portfolios, where they end up, what's been kept, what's been scrapped, and of course, very importantly, who are the chief bureaucrats, who are the secretaries of the departments that Labor will choose to run them.